All right, welcome back. So we're moving on now to chapter 3, and I'm going to break this one up into 3 smaller parts. This first lecture is just going to introduce you to what a cell is and what are some of the key parts to it, and what do you have, to be considered a cell. And then we'll kind of compare a prokaryote to a eukaryote. The next lecture, we'll go through all the different organelles and what their functions are, and give some identity to it, how they're important to the function of the cell. And then the last lecture will focus on the plasma membrane and how we do transport within the cell, how do we get stuff in and out, and also move around within the cell. So let's get started. Boom. So it starts with this statement at the top. Cells can compose organisms or actually be organisms. So you can be a unicellular organism, so a single cell. Example is this little protist right here. So it's just one single cell that makes up this entire organism. There are some protists that fall in this category. The bacteria, the Archaeobacteria fall in this category. Some very, very primitive species in the animal kingdom fall in this category too. So even if you're just one single cell, you are actually considered to be living. Now, another thing is you can also be multicellular. So we're an example of that, human. Our example is a plant right here. So this is a microscope image from a plant called Alodia. If we were doing face-to-face lab, you would have used it a lot. But you can see there's lots of different cells here. Each of these square different compartments are each an individual cell. Now, what's great about multicellular organisms, they're going to have specialized cells. So they're going to have specific jobs, but they're still going to have the same basic structure. But they might look different too, and we'll talk about why that happens when we get to gene regulation. But just to recap, especially for multicellular organisms with all the different types of cell we had, they all started at that embryonic stem cell state. And then they go through several rounds of differentiation, where they'll go to where they become pluripotent embryonic stem cells. So at that point, what we do is we designate into 3 different germ layers. And then these layers go and specify into more specific type of cells. As I mentioned, what's really cool is we figured out how to go backwards and reprogram cells. So next up, the book talks a little bit how do we visualize cells. So we would use 2 different types of microscopes. We would use a dissecting scope, which is mainly used to look at bigger things, or we also would use the actual proper light microscope, and we would use this one a lot. I'm not going to go into too much details. There's a virtual lab where they will walk you through the different parts of it, and then you'll have to look at some images so you can say that's an animal cell, that's a plant cell, that's bacteria. And I think there's a really cool movie where you get to see some microscopic images. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. I want to get to the actual fun stuff. So the cell theory composed 3 things. First thing, all things are composed of cells, which is great. If you're living, you have to be composed of cells. It could be one cell, it could be multiples. Cells are the basic unit and structure of function of living things. So if you don't have cells, you are not considered living. And then this third one, all cells are produced from other cells. Now, the guy who coined the term cell is actually called Robert Hooke. He actually came up with that name, and this is published in 1665, and it's actual image from the paper. And he used a very early microscope, and he looked at a slice of cork. And we looked at the stem. And when he looked at it, he saw all these tiny little rooms. And it kind of reminded him like a prison, like prison cells, if you think about that, how you have all these tiny little rooms. Well, cells, Latin for little room, and that's how they came to be. So regardless of your unicellular, multicellular, an eye cell, toe cell, any type of cell, plant cell, fungi, whatever kingdom you fall into, you're going to have 4 essential components. And they're shown right here. First off, you have to have DNA. If you don't have DNA, you cannot have that cookbook for life. It's going to store your genetic information, and you have to pass that on to the next generation via asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. You're going to have ribosomes. They're going to be your protein factories because proteins have a lot of key essential functions when it comes to metabolism, and they do a lot of things in cells. If you remember from the macromolecules lecture, we talked about proteins have so many different functions. In order to build those proteins, you're going to need a ribosome. You're going to need enzymes. So enzymes are actually proteins. So you're going to have these proteins made by the ribosomes, and they're going to be really essential, especially for metabolism and a lot of different functions in the cell. And finally, you need a plasma membrane. You have to have a way to separate your internal from the external environment. Now, I briefly mentioned this tree of life before, but as proposed, since all the different types of cells in the various kingdoms have these four key components. And there's also more specific things we'll talk about when we get to talking about evolution. But it's proposed that we have this all common universal ancestor. And as time changed, we started to diversify and get some more characteristics, and then they would break off from the tree and form their own individual group. But if you look at, regardless of where you fall in here, you're going to have these four components. So the next two slides kind of compare the terms prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and I briefly mentioned them in the very first lecture. So if you want to think of the prokaryotic cell as your efficiency apartment, right? You just first get out, you're getting out on your own, you probably just starting a job, you don't have a whole lot of savings, so you get the basic of what you can afford. You know, maybe it's a studio, maybe if you're lucky, you might have a one bedroom. But it's going to be just the basics you need to survive. Prokaryotic cells fall in this category. Now, they do not have a nucleus. Instead, they do have DNA. What they do is have one circular chromosome that they compress down into what's called a nucleoid. They're also going to have small pieces of circular DNA called plasmids floating around, and those are going to be super important when we get to talk about biotech. They're still going to have ribosomes floating around here and enzymes, and they're going to have that plasma membrane. Now, they're also going to do other things because they are unicellular all the time, but they also have a cell wall, which gives them more protection. Some of the bacteria will have capsules. Some of them might have a flagellum. Pili, it's used for reproduction. So just kind of understand, they do have those four key components that we talked about, but they might have some additional features too. Now, these cells, they're going to be very small and very simple, and you'll see when I open up the next slide how more complex a eukaryote is. So remember, small, simple, single. Now, the earliest cells the earliest life on Earth is thought to be in this prokaryotic resemblance. It's going to be just a single cell organism with just the basics. Your archaea and your bacteria, those two domains and kingdoms fall into this. But one key thing is there's no membrane-bound nucleus or organelles. So next up is the eukaryotic cells. So these are more complex. Even just by looking at this image right here, you can see there's a lot more stuff going on. So I kind of used the 3 C's to kind of talk about them. You're going to see they're going to be more complex. They're going to be a lot bigger. There's a lot more things going on. By being a lot larger, you can actually do a lot more things. You're going to see all these little things called organelles. Think of them as tiny organs. They each will have a specific job. In the next lecture, we'll go over what the specific ones are and what they do. They're going to be more compound. So when I talk about eukaryotic organisms, most of them are going to be composed of more than one cell. And then if it is composed of more than one cell, you might see different types of cells. And by this, they're going to be a lot larger. But having more surface area, larger cell in general, you're able to have more things, and then you can do a lot more too. So just looking at this, you can see there's all kinds of different organelles. You probably are like, there is a lot going on, but we're going to go through the different ones, and I'll point out the big things. But just comparing the prokaryote to eukaryote, you can tell this is, we're moving up in the world. We're moving up from that studio apartment. Now we can have specialized rooms. We can actually afford more cabinets in the kitchen. You know, you might actually have a guest room. Now there's two main types of eukaryotic cells that we would have looked at in lab. We would have looked at animal cells and then plant cells. The animal cells we would have looked at is you actually would have done a cheek swab. You would have taken a toothpick and scraped around inside your cheek and then stained the cells. Actually look at them under the microscope, and you would have been able to see the nucleus, which is that dark dot. So if you go to the very first slide, you can actually see cheek cells, and the dark dot you see in the middle is the nucleus, and in that little dot is 6 feet of DNA. It's really cool. And then we would also look at plant cells because I kind of pointed that out on the second slide of Velodia. Now, there's a lot of similarity between plant and animal cells. They do share a lot of organs, but there's going to be some key differences. And one of the review assignments has you go through and identify the organelles and say if it's plant, animal, or both. But one of the big things is plants are going to have a cell wall. It's going to give them more protection and support. That's where all the cellulose is located. They're going to have chloroplast, because they go through photosynthesis. They're going to have this huge central vacuole that they're going to use for storage. Those are your big things right now, but other than that, you probably see a lot of the same organelles shown up between the two. So how do you study for this? And don't stress out too much. It's a lot of organelles, but the assignment's supposed to help you with that. Basically, make sure you understand the difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote. So remember the prokaryotes before the nucleus, they do not have membrane-bound organelles, but they still have that DNA, still have that plasma membrane, still have ribosomes, still have enzymes. So these are going to be your very simple organelles, so it's very small. Versus the eukaryotes have that membrane-bound nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Your fungi, your animals, your plants, and your protists all fall into this category. Now, when it comes to learning the organelles, I kind of tell my students think of the cell as like a little city. And when we talk in the next lecture, you're going to see every organelle has a job. Like the nucleus is like City Hall. It's going to have all the blueprints for the city. The plasma membrane is kind of like the city border or town limits, however you want to think about it. The mitochondria is kind of like the power plant. The chloroplast are like the solar power plant. Every organelle has a specific job. These are two different sites that you can go to if you want to practice a little bit. You're not required to do that, but I just give y'all options to kind of help you go through it. So I'm going to stop this one right there, and the next lecture is going to go over the different organelles.